Yes, Checo P1. I'm speechless, guys. Luis, make sure Checo is watching the race, please.
This was one of the most exciting moments in Formula One, not only because Sergio Perez had just won for the first time, or because he had become the first Mexican driver to win a Formula One race in more than 50 years, but because he did it at the most important moment of his career, when he needed it the most. Checo didn't have a seat for the next season. His own team had already decided to replace him, and with the market practically closed, that was one of his last chances to prove that he deserved to stay in the top category. But that night in Sakhir changed everything. Because Checo not only won, but he did it in a race that started in the worst possible way. Driving a car with almost no chance of winning and pulling off one of the most incredible comebacks ever seen in Formula One. This is the story of Checo Perez's impossible victory. The race that gave him his first win in the category and ended up changing his life forever. To understand why that victory was so important, we have to go back a few months. Because at that time, Checo was experiencing one of the harshest ironies of his career. Perez didn't come to Sakhir as a washed-up driver, far from it. In 2020, he was having one of the best seasons of his career with Racing Point. A team that year had one of the most competitive cars on the grid. A car so similar to the previous year's Mercedes that several teams accused them of copying it, to the point of calling it the pink Mercedes. And beyond the controversy, there was something obvious. The car worked. Racing Point was no longer just a midfield team trying to score points when they could. Now it was a team capable of getting into the fight at the top, of making things difficult for McLaren, Renault, Ferrari, and even Red Bull in some races. And, in fact, both Lance Stroll and Sergio Pérez had managed to get a podium during that season. However, within that project, Checo was still the most important piece. He was consistent, took care of the tires better than anyone, scored points when the team needed them, and was having the best year of his career in Formula One. But suddenly, everything changed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you know who I am.
While Checo was delivering on the track, off it, his future was falling apart. Racing Point was about to become Aston Martin, and for that new project, the team decided to go for a huge name, Sebastian Vettel, a four-time world champion. So, the problem was obvious. If Vettel arrived, someone had to go, and that someone wasn't going to be Lance Stroll. Because Lance wasn't just a driver, he was also the son of the team owner. So the one who had to lose out was Checo, and that was the cruelest part of all. Because Perez wasn't losing his seat due to lack of performance, nor because his level had dropped. On the contrary, he was being pushed out of Formula One in his best season. And the timing didn't help either. Because when his departure was confirmed, the driver market was already practically closed. Most teams had already defined their lineup. The options were minimal, and the most attractive one of all seemed impossible. That's why every remaining race was no longer just another race, but an opportunity to change his future, to prove that he still deserved a place on the grid. That's why Sakhir mattered so much. Because Checo didn't just need a good race, he needed something that was impossible to ignore. Before Sakhir, Checo had already had a great opportunity to prove that he deserved to stay in Formula One. However, that opportunity ended in the most painful way possible. A week earlier, at the Bahrain Grand Prix, Perez was having exactly the race he needed. He had started 5th, but at the start he gained 2 positions and moved up to 3rd. And then came one of the most dramatic moments of the season, Romain Grosjean's accident. It was incredible with all that fire. What happened was truly astonishing.
There's going to be an accident. The accident with fire over there, what happened was incredible. There's going to be...
This one, wow. Look, Romain Grosjean made it out with his life. However, when the race resumed, Checo kept doing what he had to do. And for almost the entire Grand Prix, he managed to stay in 3rd place. A huge result for Racing Point, but even more important for Checo, because if he finished there, not only would he score key points for the team, but he would also achieve his 2nd podium right after the 2nd place he got in Turkey. That is, at the most important moment of his career. Perez was about to string together back-to-back podiums, but with only 3 laps to go, everything fell apart. The Racing Point started to fail, the car began to smoke, and Checo, who seemed to have the podium secured, had to retire.
There's the final dramatic plume of smoke for Checo Pérez. Unfortunately for him, Checo once again did everything he could, but there's a technical problem. Checo is left with nothing just when he was in third for another podium.
The blow was brutal, not only because he lost a huge result, but because he lost it at the worst possible moment. Right when every race could define his future. Right when he needed to prove that he still deserved to stay in Formula 1. And right when it seemed that, finally, he had a perfect opportunity to do it. But unfortunately, everything disappeared in a matter of seconds. That's why, when Formula 1 returned to Bahrain just a week later, that second race no longer felt like just another one. It was a rematch, a new opportunity to achieve what the previous race had taken away from him. However, this time, the race wasn't going to have a calm start either, because from the very first lap, things were about to start in the worst possible way. But before that, if you're enjoying the video, subscribe. The second race in Bahrain was strange from the start, because this time it wasn't held on the traditional layout, but instead on the Sakhir outer circuit, a much shorter, much faster, and much more unpredictable version. A layout where each lap lasted less than a minute, and where any mistake could change everything. However, the big story of the weekend wasn't just the circuit, it was Mercedes. Lewis Hamilton, who had already secured the World Championship, couldn't race after testing positive for COVID, and his replacement was George Russell, a driver with great potential, who until that moment was racing for Williams, but suddenly had a golden opportunity with the most dominant car. And from the start, Mercedes seemed to have everything under control. Valtteri Bottas and George Russell were going to start from the front row, and behind them would be Verstappen, Leclerc, and Perez. Checo was 5th again, just like a week before, and once again, he had a huge opportunity to get into the fight at the front and score good points. But this time, the race would only last a few corners before everything went wrong. When the lights went out, Russell had a perfect start, overtook Bottas, and took the lead. Meanwhile, Checo also had a good start. He overtook Leclerc, pulled alongside Verstappen, and for a moment it looked like he was on track to repeat a performance like the one from the previous week. But when they got to turn 4, everything changed. Charles Leclerc came in too fast, tried to get inside, and ended up hitting Checo's Racing Point. Oh no, they hit Checo.
Perez. I think Leclerc, they hit Checo Perez there. What a shame. He was in a really good position.
Leclerc damaged his car. Verstappen, who tried to avoid the accident, ended up in the gravel and was also out. And Checo, although he was able to continue in the race, dropped to the back and had to come into the pits. In just one lap, what was supposed to be a rematch turned into another disaster, because after arriving in Sakhir with the pressure to prove that he still deserved to stay in Formula 1, Checo was in last place on the first lap. It was ridiculous. A week earlier, the car had cost him a podium when there were only 3 laps to go. And now, in his rematch, it seemed like everything was over even before it started. But this time, there was a difference. The Racing Point was still in the race, and Checo was too. So while everyone was watching Leclerc's crash, Verstappen's retirement, and Russell's dream debut with Mercedes, Perez started a completely different race. A race from last place, and a comeback that, at that moment, seemed impossible. But if something had always defined Checo Pérez, it was that idea that had accompanied him for years. Never give up. Never give up. At that moment, Checo's real race began. Because after the contact with Leclerc, Perez had dropped to the last place among the drivers still on track. But most importantly, the Racing Point was still in the race. So when the safety car came in, Checo started doing the only thing he could, making a comeback. And he didn't do it by waiting for others to make mistakes. He did it by overtaking. First, he started with the cars at the back. Kimi Räikkönen, Pietro Fittipaldi, Jack Aitken, Antonio Giovinazzi, Nicholas Latifi, and Kevin Magnussen. In just a few laps, Checo had already regained several positions. But that was just the easiest part. The further he advanced, the harder the comeback became, because it was no longer just about passing slower cars. Now he had to get back into the real fight. And that's when one of the most important parts of his race began, because every rival that appeared in front of him seemed to have a different meaning. First, there was Sebastian Vettel, the driver who was going to join Aston Martin to take the place that Checo was losing. Then there was Alex Albon, the driver who at that time held one of the most coveted seats on the grid. And although no one knew for sure yet, that seat could end up being Checo's last big chance to stay in Formula One. That's why Albon wasn't just any rival, and overtaking him not only mattered in the race, but also carried enormous symbolic weight. And then he could chase him for several laps. After both of them overtook Norris, the moment arrived. And then Checo didn't hesitate.
And there goes Checo. Impeccable maneuver by Checo Pérez to take the position from Alex Albon. Checo is now in 9th place. He left the Thai driver in 10th.
With that, he completed one of the most important overtakes of his comeback, but he was still far from the podium. That same podium he had lost a week earlier, and that seemed to be lost for good after the first lap. The problem was that to get it back, the most difficult part was still ahead. Checo had already avoided disaster, but saving the race wasn't enough, because he still had to recover what mattered most, the podium. And at first, it seemed like the strategy was giving him a new chance, because since Perez had pitted on the first lap, his race was completely out of sync with the rest. While many drivers still had to pit, Checo had already made his first stop, so when the others started to come in, Perez stayed out on track. And little by little, he started to gain positions. Until, for the first time in the race, he was in 3rd place. After dropping to last place on the first lap, Checo was back in a podium position. But there was a problem. His race still wasn't over. Because sooner or later, Perez also had to pit again. And when he did, he dropped back down the order once more. Not all the way to the back like on the first lap, but enough that he had to rebuild his race. Once again, at that moment, the road to the podium got much harder again, and then another key moment appeared. Nicolas Latifi had to retire, and the race went under the virtual safety car. Some drivers who were ahead of Checo took advantage of that moment to pit. But the virtual safety car didn't last long, and that ended up hurting them, because when the race resumed, Checo was in 5th position, behind Esteban Ocon and Lance Stroll. And if he wanted to get back to that 3rd place, he had to earn it on the track. First was Stroll, his own teammate, but there was still one more to go, his former teammate, Esteban Ocon. And when the opportunity came, Perez didn't hesitate.
And there's Checo's move on Ocon. This is live. There goes Checo making the overtake. He's on the podium, gentlemen, for now, 3rd behind the Mercedes.
He overtook and regained 3rd place and completed another important part of his comeback. At that moment, Checo had not only saved his race, he had rebuilt it twice. However, the reality was clear. The Mercedes were still in another league. Russell was leading comfortably. Bottas was behind. And even though Checo was in 3rd place, which was already a huge achievement, victory seemed impossible. Because to win, he needed a miracle. And that miracle was there. It was about to happen. But before we continue, if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe. We are already more than 90,000, so we are in the final stretch to reach the much-awaited 100,000 subscribers. So join us and subscribe. Then came the moment that completely changed the race. Jack Aitken, who was replacing George Russell at Williams, lost control of his car in the final corner. He hit the wall, broke the front wing, and left debris right on the track. Then the safety car came out, and for Mercedes, it was the perfect opportunity. Russell led while Bottas was 2nd. They had the best car, they had the race under control, and with the safety car on track, they could make a pit stop. Double pit stop and protect themselves until the end. On paper, it was a logical decision, but in practice, it was a disaster. First, Russell came in, and just a few seconds later, Bottas arrived. But in the middle of the double pit stop, Mercedes mixed up the tires. Bottas's pit stop became endless.
What just happened with Valtteri Bottas is incredible. He lost his cool, he lost his focus, and so did Mercedes, man.
And when they finally sent him back on track, the Finn had lost a lot of time. For Checo, that was the ideal scenario. However, when it seemed like the chaos was over, Mercedes realized something even worse. The confusion had not only ruined Bottas's pit stop, but also Russell's, because the race leader had been given the wrong tires that belonged to Bottas's car. That's why, on the next lap, still behind the safety car, Russell had to come back into the pits. And with that second stop, everything changed. Bottas was in 4th. Russell dropped to 5th place, and Checo Pérez, the same driver who was last on the first lap, took the lead in the Sakhir Grand Prix. Mercedes had everything to win. Russell had driven almost the entire race as if it were his. Bottas seemed to have 2nd place secured, but in a matter of seconds, everything fell apart. And Checo, who had done exactly what he needed to do throughout the entire race, was in the right place when the opportunity appeared. However, he still hadn't won anything, because the safety car was still on the track. The race still had to be restarted. And behind Checo was a driver desperate to get back what he had just lost: George Russell. When the safety car left, the chase began. Russell still had the fastest car on the track, and even though he was 5th at the restart, it didn't take him long to start moving up. First, he went after Bottas, his own teammate.
Russell goes after Bottas, he puts his car alongside.
Then he went after Stroll, then after Ocon. And in just a few laps, Russell was already in 2nd place. The threat was real, because while Checo was trying to control the race from the front, Russell was closing in on fresher tires, in a very fast Mercedes, and with the urgency to recover what he had just lost. And lap after lap, the gap started to decrease. Checo was still leading, but Russell was getting closer. And with every 10th he cut down, Perez's victory started to slip away. Checo had driven the race of his life. He had come back from last place. He had rebuilt his race twice. And now, when he was finally leading, he had the most dominant car in Formula One behind him, with a driver who was flying.
You're the fastest man on track. That was 4/10 on Perez, so keep it up.
Well, you're the fastest man on the track. You're 4/10 faster than Perez, so keep it up.
For a few minutes, it seemed like the story was headed for another cruel twist, and that Checo was going to lose another great result after having done everything right. But then, when Russell's victory seemed inevitable, the race took another unexpected turn that changed everything. Then, the radio message that defined the race came through.
Looks like rear left puncture. Looks like rear left puncture.
Oh, he has a puncture.
Russell had a puncture, and in a matter of seconds, the chase came to an end. The Mercedes started to lose pace, and Russell, who seemed ready to attack Checo for the win, had to come back into the pits. And because of that stop, with only 8 laps to go, the Brit dropped down to 15th place. It was unbelievable. First, he had lost the lead because of Mercedes' mistake. Then, he had fought back up to 2nd place. And when he seemed ready to go for the win, another problem took him out of the fight for good. For Russell, it was devastating. However, for Checo, it was the moment he needed, because there was no longer a Mercedes closing in to take the victory from him. Now, for the first time, the race depended entirely on him. But even then, there were still laps left to complete. And for a driver who had been waiting 10 years for his first Formula One victory, each of those laps felt eternal. Because after everything he had been through, Checo was just minutes away from achieving something that seemed impossible. After surviving everything, Checo just had to hold on until the end. But after such a chaotic race, anything could still happen. He had started 5th. He had dropped to last place on the first lap. He had to fight his way back. He had to rebuild his race twice. And now, after all that, he was leading the Grand Prix. But this time, there was no Mercedes closing in at full speed. There was no Russell closing the gap each lap anymore. and he now had a comfortable lead over the driver behind. At that moment, it was just Checo, his racing point, and the final laps of a race that could change his life. On the team wall, the tension was enormous because they knew what was at stake. It wasn't just an unexpected victory, it was Checo's first victory in Formula One Racing Point's first victory, and the first victory for a Mexican driver in more than 50 years. Then came the final lap. Checo crossed the finish line, and after 10 years in the top tier, he had finally done it. Sergio Pérez had won the Sakhir Grand Prix.
There is the flag. Believe it, Mexico. Checo Pérez has won. Impressive, gentlemen.
Then, the message arrived that summed everything up. Check page 1.
That's right, Checo. He won. The speechless, yes? Luis, make sure Checo is watching the race, please.
That victory wasn't just Checo's first win. It was the reward for years of waiting, for years of fighting in midfield teams, for years of salvaging points in races where he never had the car to win. But that night, finally, everything went right. Because Checo hadn't just survived the disaster at the start. He hadn't just fought back. He hadn't just taken advantage of Mercedes' mistake, but he had done exactly what he needed to do throughout the entire race. And when the opportunity appeared, he was ready to move forward. That's why Sakhir 2020 wasn't a normal victory. It was an unforgettable night. Because after waiting 10 years for his first win, Perez not only won, but did it when he needed it the most, and in one of the most impressive ways possible. However, what Checo still didn't know was that this victory not only gave him his first Formula One win, but it was also about to change his life forever. But before we continue, if you want to support the channel so we can make more videos like this, subscribe. A few days later, the victory in Sakhir began to have much bigger consequences than anyone could have imagined. For months, Checo's future had been up in the air. Racing Point had already replaced him. The market was practically closed, and the possibility of being left out of Formula One was real. However, after Sakhir, something changed. Because that victory was not only exciting, but it was also impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, at Red Bull, the situation wasn't simple either. Alex Albon was leaving without fully convincing anyone. The team needed someone capable of supporting Verstappen, someone with experience and the ability to perform when the opportunity arose. Exactly what Checo had just demonstrated in Sakhir. And then, the call came that changed everything.
Hello, Richard. Hello, Sergio. Welcome to Red Bull. Thank you. Congratulations and welcome to the team.
Christian Horner picked him to race for Red Bull, and at that moment, everything that seemed to have been lost just a few weeks earlier changed completely. Checo was no longer out of Formula One, but quite the opposite. Now, he was going to drive for one of the biggest teams in the sport, alongside Max Verstappen, in a car capable of fighting at the front every weekend. That's why Sakhir 2020 was not just Checo Perez's first victory. It was the race that saved his future, the race that took him to Red Bull, and the race that turned a season that seemed headed for a goodbye into the beginning of the most important chapter of his Formula One career. However, although Checo's victory seemed impossible, there was another driver whose first win was even more surprising. Because years earlier, there was someone who achieved his first victory in a much more chaotic race. With rain, crashes, retirements, fights, and a result that no one could have imagined before the start. So watch this video if you want to know the story of the 1998 Belgian Grand Prix. The most chaotic race in the history of Formula One,